Hi there, my name is Luke Rochester. I'm about to show you how to build a dashboard with FileMaker. Now before I begin, FileMaker has asked me to explain why I'm qualified to give this presentation, and I was going to start with my experience and then talk about my qualifications and maybe even throw in a few interests, but I realised if I flip these around it's actually a pretty good description of who I am because my interests haven't changed that much over the years. I've been adding qualifications as I go and my experiences change every day. So my main interest, like a lot of you, is really to spend as much time as I can with my family. When I'm not spending time with my family, my preference is to be out surfing. But both of these are fairly irrelevant for today's topic. However, I've got a few interests that are relevant. This explains why I build the kind of dashboards I do. I'm fascinated by psychology in one area in particular, peak experiences, which is those goosebumps you get when you're operating at your full potential and living your life that way, self-actualization. There's some debate whether that's even possible. I'm also interested in businesses and looking at them as a complex system and playing around with different patterns and using mathematics to try and predict what's going to happen in the future. I'm a new tech kind of guy, but I do remember a time before computers, which I think for those of you that share that with me gives us a unique perspective on computers. In terms of my qualifications, I've got a grade dip in psychology, honours degree in engineering, advanced certificates in multidimensional, and of course relational databases. I'm FileMaker certified. So my experience, well, in those areas, I've done some suicide counselling and learnt a great technique called active listening. Director of a Fortune 500 once was quoted as saying that the work that I did for him saved the company millions of dollars in a matter of weeks by predicting mistakes before they happened. I'll be happy to share that as a case study with anyone that's interested. Working for a pharmaceutical company in Australia, we tried to predict what was going to happen after the biggest product recall in the country's history. And in terms of new technology, my latest project is one business app, and you're going to find out a bit more about that today. So let's get on to it. The 45 tips and tricks are broken into sections, so I'm going to basically take you on a roadmap through from the very basics of getting started to building your first pivot table in FileMaker and how that can help you build a simple dashboard. Talk about key performance indicators to build a more sophisticated dashboard. And then we'll talk about mobile dashboards as proof, if you like, that FileMaker is able to provide the performance necessary to deliver dashboards to mobile devices. I won't talk about the back-end BI stack. I did cover that at DevCon in Vegas earlier this year, and this presentation is similar to the one I gave at DevCon. However, I have taken out the back-end BI stack because I don't have quite as much time today. And then finally, I'm going to take a few tips and tricks that help us look ahead. So let's get started. The first thing the first tip I've got for you if you're going to build a dashboard is to know what a dashboard is. It sounds a bit silly, but I do think it's important that you provide context for the people you're working with because a lot of people have different ideas about dashboards and some people have no idea what it is. Now a more traditional dashboard, for those people who've heard of them, are probably going to be thinking about something like the one you see on the screen now, where you can slice and dice and drill into information. However, that is one example of a dashboard, but I'm more excited about the dashboards we can build with FileMaker, where not only can we build them for laptops and desktops and multi-monitors, but we can build them for very small devices like iPhones. And this is a fly screen that I designed to help a CEO of a small company get an instant snapshot of how the company is going. This one is showing profit and how it's comparing to the target profit. Let's imagine that this CEO has logged into the system and perhaps flipped the phone into portrait mode. After having seen the total company profit, they can now see a breakdown of how that profit got there. So they can see sales, marketing, operations, etc. Now, when I work with a client, I like to show them a screen exactly like this one and talk to them a little bit about just the basic idea of dashboards and how they differ on a mobile device to, let's say, a desktop. But more recently, I've been using a 1-minute video, which I'm going to show you today, and it's on the home page of my website, and I would be more than happy for you to show your clients and your colleagues to help give people not only an idea of what a dashboard is, but how it benefits a company and how beneficial a small dashboard running on an iPhone can be. So to run this video, I'm actually just going to press play and let the sound run back through the mic. So I'm kind of hoping this works. I think.
Are you waking up in the middle of the night trying to understand where your business is going? Well, now you can have a list of everything that's important in the palm of your hand with just one business app. You can easily see profits. Just tap to go into details, where you can see, for example, your opportunities and your biggest threats. And Siri is also there to help you.
What are the biggest threats to my business? Set up an appointment with Fred for 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Now you can go back to sleep without any concerns. At least until tomorrow.
Now, if you missed that, then send me an email and I'll help you out with it. If you go to that web address you see on the screen right now, you can download the sample file that you're going to see later in this presentation today. So I've got the sample file there for free for people to download, but there's also some more sophisticated training modules that you can get involved with if you want to really get into the details. I'm going to go through these tips fairly quickly today, so if you do want to delve into the details, you may be interested to go to that website, look at some of the free stuff that I've got, some of the free videos I provide, or even maybe consider enrolling in one of the training programs. Alright, so let's get on to tip number 2. So you and your colleagues and your customer knows what a dashboard is, and strangely enough, I think the next thing you should do is really start at the end. And what I mean by that is talk to them about what it is they want to actually achieve, and so that you get their buy-in, get them to sketch on a piece of paper what they think would be really cool to be sitting on their iPhone when they start the day. Now, you have provided context, they've already seen the commercial or they've seen some screenshots that you've shown them, so they know roughly what a dashboard is, so it's a bit easy for them to then sketch on a piece of paper what they would like to see. And there's some great free software out there, one of them's called Prototype on Paper, and you can actually take photos of their sketches and then hot link them, so you can give them back an iPhone app that shows them the sketches they've just done and even hot links the button, so when you press that button it goes to that sketch. It's pretty cool stuff and it's a great way to rapidly develop an application. Now, I mentioned before that I'm not going to go into the details of the BI stack, but I did just want to show you briefly that FileMaker has something to offer for every single stage of the BI stack. And there's even another area that people don't often talk about, and that is the gaps in information, and FileMaker's great at doing little gap filler apps. So that you can actually capture all the information that you need. And if we look at the BI stack in a little bit more detail, when I talk to customers about it, I talk to them about 3 different types of data sources over there on the left. One is unstructured data, the other is semi-structured data, and that's really a relational database like FileMaker. And the third one is structured data, where they might already be storing cubes. You need to pull all that information together, put it into one database, often referred to as a data warehouse. You may want to do ad hoc analysis, or you may just want to distribute reports every day to various devices using different user interfaces. Now, to make all this work, there's a little picture of a person in the middle there with a KW, which stands for knowledge worker. You'll need someone from inside the customer who understands the business processes and where the information can be found. This kind of person is typically a bit of a hybrid. They're good with computers, they're good with business processes, and they're good with people. Now, trick number 4 is a little exercise. I'm going to show you how to think in multiple dimensions. So I kind of prefer to close my eyes to do this, but you don't have to. I want you to imagine a 3-dimensional cube, 1 meter high, 1 meter wide, 1 meter deep. Just imagine it sitting still in your mind. Now, we could bring in the 4th dimension, which is time, but we're going to ignore that for the moment, so we're not going to move it around, we're just going to leave it sitting still. And so the 3 dimensions are height, width, and depth. Now, a 4th dimension we can bring in is color. And we're going to do that by imagining a second cube in exactly the same position. So now you've got 2 cubes, both of them a meter high, a meter wide, a meter deep, and they're both in exactly the same position. But one cube, imagine, is red and one is blue. The only thing distinguishing these 2 cubes are their color. So if you use the traditional 3 or 4 dimensions of physics, you can't see the difference between these 2 cubes. You need another dimension, in this case we've called it color, to distinguish between the red cube and the blue cube. Now we could bring in a 5th dimension, say temperature. So imagine that the red cube is hot and the blue cube is cold. And we could bring in a 6th dimension and call it texture. Perhaps the red hot cube is soft and the blue cold cube is hard. So you can open your eyes now. That's really a little trick to help you think in multiple dimensions. And that's going to help us because the next thing we're going to look at, tip number 5, is how to create a multi-dimensional cube using something like FileMaker. Now, it's actually easier than you think, and this does comply with industry standards on how to structure cubes. So you can look up Google or Wikipedia and you'll see that this is really legit stuff. This really is how to create a cube. And if we talk about it in terms of FileMaker, just imagine you've got one single flat table where your column headings or your field names are actually dimensions or referred to as dimensions. And if you have text that's being repeated inside of those fields, then they're your elements, and I'll show you that in just a second. And finally, if you've got numbers that you can summarize by either averaging or totaling them up or taking a maximum or minimum, that's referred in this terminology as our values. So here's what that would look like. A single table in FileMaker where you can see we've got some dimensions, product, customer. And if we look at customer, for instance, you might say that customer is the overall dimension and customer name is a sub-dimension of the customer dimension. But for all intents and purposes, all these fields are different dimensions. So you've got customer name, territory, and industry. And if you look at territory, you can see that the text there is north, south, east, and west. So they're your elements. There's only 4 elements to the territory dimension. Those 4 elements are north, south, east, and west. So that's dimensions and elements for you. If you are talking to people in the industry and they talk about a star schema, don't be scared off. It's basically, if we're using the FileMaker relationship diagram here, star schema is where you have the blue table in the middle, which stores your transactions, and you're just basically showing one level of relationships into the red table occurrences. So if you're just looking at blue and red tables on the screen in front of you now, you're looking at a star schema. If they talk about a snowflake schema, it's very similar. It just takes on a little bit more complexity. And in the same diagram we're looking at now, if you included the green table occurrences, in other words, you're moving away from the transactional table, which is often called a fact table. You're moving more than just one relationship. You've got, in this case, we've got 2 relationships that we're moving away from the central fact table. And that's really your snowflake schema. And when you've got this schema up and running, you typically transfer all that information into another table, which is you'll refer to as your data warehouse. So that's given you some of the industry terminology. The next thing I wanted to do was give you a glimpse of the FileMaker dashboard. But before I do that, we're about to get into some of the heavier parts of the session. So I just want to let you know that if you're finding this is moving too fast, don't panic, because there are various stages of learning that are going to be happening for you regardless of your level of experience. And this is really designed today for more advanced FileMaker developers, or at least intermediate developers. So if you're not terribly advanced, you might find this moving a bit quick, but you'll still get something out of it because of this first stage of learning, where it's aimed at helping people who are unconsciously unskilled. In other words, you may not even have known that FileMaker could build dashboards. So today, you're going to be made aware of different things that you can do with FileMaker. Those who have got a little bit more skills, not only will they become aware that it's possible, but they'll pick up the skills straight away and they'll be consciously unskilled. So what that means is they can actually build dashboards, but they have to really think about it and follow all the steps that you see in today's session. People who are even more advanced, or perhaps if you've done this kind of thing before, you might be consciously skilled, which means you can just fire away and build these at will. Or if you're really advanced and you've been doing this a lot, then you can be unconsciously skilled. And you probably know that feeling when you're writing a script in FileMaker that you've written 100 times. You really don't have to think about it. Your fingers almost just write the script on autopilot. So with all that said, let's now have a glimpse of the FileMaker dashboard that we're about to build.
Hi there, here's a pivot table and chart working in FileMaker. As you can see, we've started off with a brand versus territory, and this little table is modular, which means you can just move it around and plonk it on a layout. I'm demonstrating that right now by putting it on tabs to show you that it's not in table view or list view. Here we have the Y dimension is selected as brand, the X dimension is selected as territory. We can put on the chart a different brand Y for instance, or if we like, we can go to brand Z and put that on the chart. More importantly, we can change the dimension from territory, east, north, south, west, and put it down to, say, 12 months worth of sales. And as you can see, profit is selected, so we're looking at profit at the moment. And if we look at brand Y, we can see that there's actually been losses made in February and May, and it also shows up in the table down below as well. Before we had territory on the X dimension, we could actually put territory on the Y dimension if we like. And now what we're seeing is the 12 months worth of sales broken down by territory, and as before, we can now look through the territories on the chart. Not only that, but instead of looking at profitability, we can look at quantities. And there we have volume sales in units showing on the chart. And if we go back to brand, we can demonstrate the fact that this is actually linked into the raw data. So this is refreshing in real time. Let's go to the raw data. And on this first row, we've got 100 units being sold in January, and it's brand X. So let's make that a lot different, make it 10,000 units. Go back to our pivot table, and what we find are those 10,000 units sitting there in January 2012. So we can go back there, take those extra units out, back to our pivot table, and as we would expect, it's back to normal. What's probably most impressive about all of this is that this can all be built using a very simple structure. All you need are 6 fields, and 4 of those 6 fields are just simple text fields. The other 2 fields are the calculations that do all the work.
Now we can go ahead and build this pivot table in FileMaker. So the first thing you need is a thing called a utility table, and that's basically just another table that you add to your solution that doesn't relate to any real data inside the company that your database is modeling. So once you've got this table, you've really knocked off trick number 7. So that's nice and simple, just a brand new table inside your solution in FileMaker. Trick number 8 is to add a field to that, and we're going to call that field the X dimension. If you want to get really fancy, instead of typing in what the X dimension is, you might put a nice little drop-down box so that people can select from a predetermined list of X dimensions that you're going to offer them as part of your dashboard. After you've done the X dimension, you do another field, and that'll be the Y dimension. Both of these can be global for this particular instance, because it's going to stay the same for that entire dashboard. And then finally, the third field, again another global field, can be the value selector. So that tells us whether they want their dashboard to be showing profit or quantity or expense or whatever it is they want to see inside the actual dashboard in the numbers of the dashboard. So far so good, right? This is pretty simple stuff. We're now going to move on to the slightly more sophisticated area, and this is where beginners may have a bit of a hard time keeping up. Certainly if you haven't heard of an SQL statement, you're in trouble. But here it is, an SQL statement, which is just a simple function within FileMaker. And here, this particular one on the screen right now is saying select distinct products from cube, which means go to the field called products of the table called cube and bring back all of the text values that you see in that field. Now by putting the word distinct in, it won't show us repeats, it'll just show them each one once. So it'll give us a distinct list. And that, as you may recall from earlier in the session, is the definition of elements within a dimension. So what we see there are elements within the products dimension. Now, when we do this inside the dashboard, we don't want it to be hard-coded. So instead of saying, for example, the first commented line is saying select brand from cube, we're going to say select whatever the user has selected as their Y dimension from the table called cube. In this case, if they'd selected brand, it would bring back those 3 elements, brand X, Y, and Z. Now, when we do that, we need to also run a script, because as you can see from the script in front of you, what we're actually doing is showing all records and then deleting them. So in other words, this utility table is a table where we are basically just using it as temporary storage. So every time the script runs, it says, get rid of all my records, and repopulate them with the elements that we've just found from the dimension that has been selected. And that's effectively what that script is doing. So if you've actually done that properly, then you'll have a layout that looks like this, where you've selected brand as your Y dimension, and you've run the script, and you've received these 3 records, which are showing us the 3 elements within the brand dimension. Again, not too complicated so far. When we go to do the X-axis elements, you would think it's the same as the Y-axis, but it's not. It's slightly different, because we're going to make use of something inside a FileMaker called repeating fields, and therefore we still use a similar SQL statement, but now what we're going to do is take each of those elements and place them across in each of the repetitions of the repeating field. And if you just simply retype the the formula you see on the screen now. It'll work for you, or even easier, you can go to the website, download the free sample file from today's session, and you can actually see it in action. So our x-axis elements would give, before I talk about the x-axis elements, let me just show you one other thing. Because you've got repeating fields, you might have, say, 20 repeating fields, but you might only bring back 3 elements. So you don't want to see all 20 fields, you only want to see the 3 fields that represent the 3 elements that you just brought back. So you just use a simple conditional formatting where you say, if the value is empty, then basically hide that cell or hide that repeating field. So then what you get is a layout like this, where you've selected Brand as your Y dimension, and you probably have a script trigger so that if anyone changes the Y dimension, it reruns the script and repopulates the screen with the new elements. So we've got the Y dimension, which is Brand here, is showing 3 records, and for the X dimension, which is territory, it's throwing those 4 elements across the top in that repeating field. So we're starting to get the structure of this pivot table, and you're probably starting to see where this is going. Now, after we've got the X-axis selected, I just wanted to show you quickly one of the typical things you want to put on the X-axis is the time dimension, and a formula that I've used over and over again is the one you see on the screen right now, where I just take a date field and create a year-month calculation so that it looks like this when you run it across the dashboard. So you've got each of the months separated into different buckets. It's a very easy thing to do. It can be done in a matter of seconds. And now that you've got your x-axis and your y-axis sorted out and you know what values you're looking for, it's time to come to the crux of this pivot table. And this is the most important calculation that you're going to use today. So I'm going to go through it one step at a time. Again, we're using execute SQL function. And if we wrote the one that you see on the screen here, where we said select sum, then in brackets profit from cube, you're basically saying to FileMaker, or you're saying to the SQL function in particular, go to the table called cube, look at the field called profit, and instead of bringing back the numbers in that field like you've been doing in the past with SQL, what I want you to do is just sum up all of the numbers you see in that column called profit and just bring me back the total sum. So that's how that particular SQL statement works. If we get a little bit trickier with it, and rather than just saying select profit from cube, we say select profit from cube where brand equals brand X, and then on the last line we've added another where statement, and we're saying where year and month equals 2012-01, then the SQL won't take the profit for the entire table, of course. It will just give you the profit for the records in that table where brand equals brand X and year month equals 2012-01. So this is bringing us back a sum of just a portion of the table. And we can use that to help calculate dynamically different cells within our pivot table. And the way we do that is using this formula you see on the screen now. Now, this is the most important formula of the presentation. I'm not going to spend all day on it, but if you're going to pause the video when you're watching this back again later, this is probably the one you want to be looking at and poring over and typing it in yourself and playing with it in your own time. I'm going to run through it real quickly because we've got all the pieces in place already. It's an execute SQL statement. We're summing whatever value has been selected in our value selector field. We're taking it from the table called cube. We're only taking the values where we see the Y dimension equaling whatever's been selected as the Y dimension, and where the X dimension equals whatever has been selected as our X dimension. And you can see there that the Y and X dimensions are treated slightly differently in the last 2 lines. In fact, if I bring my arrow, I can actually point at them. So the SQL statement is saying use a carriage return to separate the fields, use a carriage return to separate the rows when you bring back the answers. And based on this part of the equation where it's saying I want to use whatever's in the Y dimension, it gets that from the field called Y. And where it says I want to use everything that's selected in the X dimension, it's getting it from the various repetitions across the top that are in that repeating field. So again, a little bit of a complicated formula, but once you've got that formula nailed, you end up with what you're seeing on the screen now, which is this dynamic pivot table where you can just change dimensions and instantly see your table populate with the relevant values. And that's really the heart of the pivot table, which is itself the heart of the dashboard that we're going to be seeing today. So although the concepts are quite complicated, the execution of this, or the implementation of this solution, is really very fast, because as you can see, you've got this new table that you create in every solution. So it's a utility table that gets created, and it's only got 6 fields. 4 of those fields are just simple text fields, so there's nothing to them. It's the last 2 fields where you have the calculations, where you're doing all the work. So you now know how to create a FileMaker pivot table, or at the very least you're aware of the fact that it is possible. Given that you can now do that, you can move on and create a simple FileMaker dashboard. And the way we do that is to start with a chart. Now, after doing all that hard work, the chart is really quite easy. As long as you have the data source selected as the current record, then for the x-axis, you simply select the x field. And by putting it in a list, it just puts it in the right format for the chart to interpret what you're actually what you've got there as your x value. And for the y-axis, the actual data or the values we're going to show on the chart, as you guessed, it's come from the field that we've already created called the value field. So the chart can be created literally in seconds after you've done all this hard work. After you've got your pivot chart sitting above your table, you've got the beginnings of a pretty cool little dashboard. It will look something like this if you've been following the steps that I've presented so far. Now, the next thing you're going to want to do is make it modular. By making it modular, it simply means you can move it around your layout, so you're not really stuck to records being shown in a particular layout. Not only can you move it around layouts, but you can have multiple dashboards sitting next to each other. So you could have several tables, several charts, all on the one layout if you had a big enough monitor or a multi-monitor situation. So the way to do that is to go ahead and create a link between the utility table that you created. So I've called my utility table dashboard, and you can pick any other table in your solution. In this particular case, I've picked the user table, and it's showing an all link between any 2 fields in those 2 tables. And what you're basically saying is, if I go to a layout based on the user table, I should be able to pull information from the dashboard table. And because I've used an all connector, it will simply bring back all of the records that were created in that dashboard table. When you do that, you have to place it onto your layout, and you use a portal to do that, which is a fairly simple tool that I'm hoping you're all familiar with. It will look something like that, and our conditional formatting will tidy it up for us, so that if we start making changes like I'm doing now, then you'll see the chart will change, and you'll also see that the table below will change as you're selecting different dimensions, as we saw in the video a few minutes back. So there's your modular pivot table and chart using one simple relationship link and only 6 fields in a new table. So once you've started building these things, they're pretty quick to create. You may be saying, hey Luke, this is only 3 dimensions, you promised us multiple dimensions. Well, multiple dimensions are right there waiting for you. All you need to do is keep adding AND statements to your SQL. And as you see on the screen now, you might have had your Y and X dimension already set up. You can add Z1, Z2, Z3. In fact, you can add as many of these Z fields as you like, or Z dimensions as you like. So when you're actually doing your filtering on the dashboard, you can not only filter by, let's say, customer and product, you could also filter by employee and brand and territory, and basically go as far as you like with that. So it is truly multidimensional, and you've got yourself a simple FileMaker dashboard. Once you've got that under your belt and it's sunk in, you may want to build something a little bit more sophisticated, and the best thing to use to bring on the sophistication are KPIs, or key performance indicators. And one way of doing that is to start with a target. And now the cool thing about what we've been doing so far is some customers have said to me, look, we don't have targets, so is this any use to us? Well, yeah, it is. You can actually generate targets automatically. And here's a simple example where I've expanded the calculation to make it easy to follow. Basically, all I've done here for year 1, I've added up 12 months worth of actual data. And then I've taken a growth factor. So if the customer said, look, we want to grow the business by 5% per annum, then I've taken that 5% and said, looking at the actuals for last year and increasing those by the 5% per annum, I get new numbers for the following year, year 2, year 3, year 4. And what that's giving you are these future targets, but they are automatically being generated. And so what's making this really powerful is no matter which part of the company the user is slicing and dicing into, they're seeing precise targets being calculated. And once you have these targets being calculated, you're really only adding one extra field to that 6-field utility table. You're only adding one field for the targets. It allows you, and there it is there blown up so you can see what's going on, it allows you to then go and calculate gaps. So where are the gaps in the business? Where is my actual missing my target? And once you've got your gaps, you can use what is typically used for KPIs, where you say divide my actual by my target. So if you've actually sold 90 units and you're supposed to sell 100, then your result is 90%. Something a little bit more sophisticated, and one that's really useful in organizations where you're comparing two different departments that might have vastly different orders of magnitude being sold. So you might have a small new department that's only selling 100 units, another area of the business that's selling 1,000 units. What you might want to compare is their progress over time. So which one is getting better, which one is getting worse. So in mathematics terms, you have to differentiate the performance calculation, but in simple terms, that just basically means you're looking at a trend line of the performance. So if you plot performance on a chart, take the trend line, that's giving you your progress. You might be doing this in this organization where you do have, say, one product that's selling 100,000 units, another one that's selling 10 units. You want to make sure that you've got a calculation telling you which one's contributing the most to the business. And I like to use this formula where I actually include both the target and the actual, and then I divide it by 2, so I'm getting an average of the target and the actual. If you're doing that, you can create these KPI icons, or key performance indicator icons. And a few years back, I created the screen you see on the iPhone now, and that's showing you that you've got contribution as a bar over on the right, and you've got some colors, and they're blue arrows if the contribution is low, so it only bothers to color them if it's a big contributor. But more recently, I've had more success with the layout that just appeared. And here you can see one arrow is showing you the color, which is the current performance, the direction, which is the progress, and I'm using the shading to communicate contribution to the business. So Ali Jones, for instance, is not contributing much because she's got only an outline. Maddie Smith is a big contributor. If you look down the page to Nate Jones, he is a medium contributor because he's got a lightly shaded arrow. So this is how you can get quick information communicated to the user. If you've gone to the trouble of calculating trends, you could take another step further and actually do forecasts, statistical forecasts. And because most people need to or want to adjust their forecasts, you typically have a name for that and you call it a plan, which is just your forecast with the adjustments included. And if you've gone and created yourself a plan and you've obviously got your actuals, then you can create this version that I've referred to with a lot of my customers called an outlook. And the thing about the outlook is it's always a full year figure. So if you're 6 months through the year, then 6 months are actuals and 6 months are plans. If you're at the end of the year, then you've got 12 months of actuals. And if you're at the start of the year, you've got 12 months of plans. So no matter where you are in the year, your outlook is always communicating a full year of figures. If you do that, you can create what is sometimes looking a little bit like artificial intelligence. You can automatically do a SWOT analysis where you can automatically determine strengths. So in other words, if you've got an area of the company, let's call it a customer for instance, where their performance is greater than the target, and I use standard deviations, again, this is just something you can calculate based on the raw figures. If the performance is greater than the target by more than 2 standard deviations, then I tell the customer this is a strong performing area of their business that they may want to consider investing more money in because it's actually already returning them a lot of results. If it's at the other end of the scale, if it's performing 2 standard deviations below the target, this is a weak performer in their business. And not only can these things be applied to customers and products, you can also apply them to employees. So you can actually automatically do performance reviews of your staff by simply gathering the data. And a good example are sales reps. Very easy to see how a sales rep is performing just based on their actuals versus their target. The other area which is even more interesting is if you consider the definition we used for Outlook earlier, you can actually predict how that area of the company is going to perform at the end of the year. If your Outlook is above target by more than 2 standard deviations, then you've got an opportunity in the business. In other words, you've got an area of the business that you are fairly certain is going to outperform the target. So you know this perhaps halfway through the year, and you might therefore again want to reinvest even more money into promoting that particular area of your business because it's already doing so well, and you may even want to lift the targets. At the other end of the scale, you've got your threats, and this is where you're predicting that by the end of the year your outlook is going to be far below target, because you might find already halfway through the year that the forecast, the prediction of the outlook, is less than 2 standard deviations below your target. Sorry, more than 2 standard deviations below your target. So this is how you can do automatic analysis of your data inside of FileMaker based on the dashboard that we've already seen. So if we're going to look at that on a chart, it would look something like this. And the main thing to look at here are the projections based on a 12-month rolling average. The big blue dots are the actuals. This is best case scenario, most likely scenario, worst case scenario, and that's the target. You can see the best case scenario is far below the target. So you could tell this company that in this particular area of the business, they're definitely going to miss their target at the end of the year. Now that we've talked about KPIs and how you can use them to build a more sophisticated dashboard, I'm going to talk about mobile dashboards. Now, before we get into using FileMaker for a mobile dashboard, I do want to say you can just export the data to any OLAP system, and the data is formatted perfectly up until this point to be used in a BI tool. And in fact, you may even want to just simply export the data for something like Excel, where you can actually build your own dashboards. And what I've got now is a video to show you how you can actually build a dashboard in Excel in under a minute. So let's.
Hi there, in this video I'm going to show you how to build a dashboard in Excel in under a minute. We've got a fairly standard Excel spreadsheet there. What we're going to do is insert pivot table to begin with. We're going to take the defaults, then we're going to bring date down and group it into years, months, quarters and days. But we don't need to see the days or the months, just the quarters and years. We're going to look at brand and profitability. We'll format that so it looks just a little bit better and insert some rows so we can put in a chart. We're going to use a pivot chart so it actually changes as you change the selections later on. We'll insert a column as well just so the screen looks a little bit more balanced, and we'll just tidy up that chart. Next thing we'll do is insert some slices, and we're going to need products, size, brand, customers, territory and employees. Now it's been over just half a minute, and we're going to spend almost the rest of the minute just tidying up the screen a little bit. Only going to show that you can actually build a dashboard in under a minute using Excel. So they look a little bit tidier now. We're going to group the colors so customers and territories go together and all the product slices go together. Get rid of the lines and the grid so it looks less like Excel and more like a dashboard. And as you can see, we had a stopwatch going there to keep me honest, and it took under a minute to create that dashboard. Okay, and let's just now look at the dashboard in action. Let's say you're having a meeting with rep number 1. And you want to first look at sales just made in the east. You could change the territory to the north, or you could go east and south, and you can see which customers belong to those territories immediately. You could look at only large products, and you can see that they're selected there, and there are no brand Z large products. Clear all the filters, and you're back to where you started from. So you can see that this dashboard very quickly allows you to slice and dice into your company data. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.
So is if I can build a dashboard in under a minute in Excel, why am I bothering to build it in FileMaker? Well, I hope to answer that question with tip number 34. We need to talk about the difference between Management BI and Discovery BI. In my books, Discovery BI is when you're doing it ad hoc in real time on large amounts of data. Management BI, on the other hand, is where you have predetermined calculations just like KPIs, and you only have to update them once a day, and in a lot of cases with a lot of my customers once a week or even once a month is fine, and you've actually got specific objects that you can identify. Now, to make a little bit more sense of this and to give you an idea of just of the scope of this of the differences here, if you imagine you've got a small company with 10 customers, 10 products and 10 sales representatives, if I was to ask you how many combinations there are, you'd be tempted to say there's 1,000, 10 times 10 times 10. But 1,000 is really just telling us how many individual combinations there are. As we know, you might have one customer buying several products, or you might have several customers buying one product. So in other words, you've got a many-to-many relationship. In fact, if we include the sales reps, you've got a many-to-many-to-many relationship. And therefore, you've got these combinations that can appear. And if I said to you how many combinations are there, it's a lot greater than 1,000. And in fact, the number is closer to 8.5 billion different things you could be looking at. So if you're talking about Discovery BI, your tool needs to handle 8.5 billion different possibilities. And that's why Management BI is often a great place to start when you're building dashboards with a company for the first time. And hence, if you're doing Management BI, FileMaker is just fine as a tool to use with them. So if you're going to create these KPIs, I recommend you create a second table next to your utility table, which looks exactly the same, but it's just storing values. And I call these a KPE table, or Key Performance Element table, because there's a record for every element we identified previously. And if you're going to have a table, it's going to look something like this, which is identical to the last one, but you don't have any calculations, because what you're going to do is write a script that's going to loop through and populate each of those fields with the value that was calculated in the utility field. So you can have a look at this script later on in your own time, but basically it's just looping through and transferring your calculations into value-only fields, so it works great as a data warehouse. Thing to watch out for, make sure that you do not have it recalculate when needed. If you can't remove the tick in that box, then you need to restructure your solution, because you don't want a huge table recalculating values every time the user opens a layout. If you do this, you have these objects now, or records in your database that you can attach notes to, and you can use it for collaboration. More importantly, you can run that night script, which identifies threats automatically and attaches them to KPE. So you've got this kind of artificial intelligence where you could perhaps have once a day a note going out saying, the system identified a new threat to the business. Please add a comment to item number 2 to remove this alert from your inbox. So this is kind of not only automating the data, it's also automating your processes. When you're doing this, it's good to think about cascading KPIs. In other words, have a system where you're looking at, say, the top 7 to 10 KPIs, and you can actually drill into them and show more information as you go. The other thing is have a think about using larger devices. So when you're using an iPad or a laptop or a desktop, you can actually have a lot more information on the screen. So you could actually be navigating through the KPIs and be seeing the charts and the actual numbers as you go. You can also create fairly sophisticated tables of data where you're showing the user exactly how you came up with the answer about a particular threat or opportunity for the business, or for instance, how you calculated their KPIs. Of course, you can add task management. A lot of you are used to using FileMaker as a task manager, but now these tasks are attached to performance in the business. And as I mentioned earlier, you can sit there and kind of gaze out at the horizon as you think about what would be a great fly screen for the company. One of the main things I like to use when I'm talking to customers is this main screen you're seeing right now. This is a great way to show them just how much you can summarize into one screen when you're using FileMaker to do these dashboards on a mobile device. And we're into the last few tips now. One of them is how you can use Siri for voice activation. It's actually a lot simpler than you ever imagined. I was doing this years ago. Basically, when you go to type text into a field on an iOS device, you'll see a little microphone appear at the bottom. So use that microphone, speak your text, and it will go into the text field, and then you just have a little script trigger that runs through a script like the one you see on the screen now, and it's looking for keywords. So if the user said something like threat, or I often put other words in there that sound like threat, like thread, if the user says any of those words, then it runs off and produces a layout based on a script which tells the user, here are the threats in your business, and you can do that for any of the keywords. So we're going to skip past the back-end BI stack as I mentioned. What we're going to do is finish up here by looking ahead with the last 2 tips. The first one is this Tibetan monk once had a great expression for the meaning of life. He said, do you know what the secret to life is? It's just one thing. And if you stick to that, everything else don't mean shit. Oop, I wasn't supposed to say that on a webinar, but I did. Okay, it wasn't really a Tibetan monk. It was a dodgy cowboy on a really bad Billy Crystal movie, but I love the line so much that I had to include it in this presentation. And for those of you that have seen the movie, you'll know that Billy Crystal then says back to the cowboy, okay, that's great, it's just one thing, but what is that one thing? That's the secret to life. And of course, the cowboy says, well, that's for you to work out. Now, I kind of like it. It's a cheesy movie, but I like that idea. And with so many people saying that business is becoming more and more complex and data overload is overwhelming, if I talk to them about the fact they could actually stop managing all of these different things in their business, so time and money and people and products and brands and territories and gross profit, net profit after tax, before tax, there's just so many things they could be managing. If you say to them, well, there's only one thing you really need to manage, and that is performance. In other words, how are all of these different things going compared to your expectations? And if you do that, you can see that there is a future for you where you might be just wearing a watch one day, something like an Apple Watch. You're a sales rep, and as you drive out to a customer, the GPS in the watch has worked out that you're about to get to customer XYZ, so it flashes on the screen this red arrow. So as you're driving your car, you glance at your watch and you see the red arrow is telling you that this customer is red, so it's performing badly this month. However, the arrow is going up, so they're getting better, so you shouldn't be too terrible to them when you get there. But the arrow is hollow, which means they're a small contributor to the business, so you shouldn't really spend all day talking to this customer. And you've got all of that information captured in just a quick glance of your watch, because that watch, and you could even then talk to the watch and say, tell me more information, what product have they not ordered this month that they normally order. So you've got the GPS, Siri, and AI. The exciting thing is the future is already here. You can do all of this on your iPhone today because your iPhone has GPS, Siri, and AI. So if you've got any questions, we can go through some of them now, or you can just jump onto that website, One Business App, where you can contact me. Feel free to sign up for the free downloads and videos, and there's some online training where I go through these concepts in a lot more detail, and I welcome people to contact me, and you'll find the sample file there as well. So thanks very much for today. That's a wrap for our tips and tricks.